Every day we wake up to news that reminds us of how fragile life truly is. Today, the world lost four remarkable American legends. People who inspired us, entertained us, and shaped our culture in ways we'll never forget. Their stories remind us that greatness isn't about how long we live. It's about the mark we leave behind. It was a quiet morning when the news broke. Susan Stamberg, one of the most recognizable and trusted voices in American radio, had passed away at the age of 87. For millions who grew up hearing her calm tone on the airwaves, the loss felt deeply personal, like saying goodbye to a familiar friend who had been part of their lives for decades. Born in Newark, New Jersey in 1938, Susan Stamberg's journey into broadcasting began long before her voice became a national companion. She started as a writer and producer in local radio before joining a young, ambitious network that would soon reshape the sound of American journalism, National Public Radio. When NPR launched All Things Considered in 1971, it was a bold experiment. Radio news was still dominated by men. The idea of a woman anchoring a national news broadcast was unheard of. But in 1972, Susan Stamberg stepped behind the microphone and changed everything. She didn't just read the news, she told it with warmth, curiosity, and quiet authority. Listeners heard not only headlines but human stories. Her interviews weren't confrontations, they were conversations. She had the gift of listening, and through that, she helped listeners understand. Whether she was talking to world leaders, artists, or ordinary citizens, her voice carried empathy and calm. One of her colleagues once said, "Susan didn't just report the story, she made you feel part of it." That was her power. She gave NPR its tone, intelligent, gentle, and deeply human. Throughout her years on All Things Considered, Stamberg became a household name. Her annual cranberry relish recipe segment during Thanksgiving became an American tradition, part journalism, part joy. It was playful and personal, a reminder that even in news there was room for warmth. By the 1980s, Susan Stamberg had already achieved what few in her profession ever could. She had earned the public's trust. Her voice symbolized credibility and care, but her legacy extended far beyond her own broadcasts. She became a mentor to generations of journalists, especially women, who saw in her success the proof that they too could belong in the newsroom. Her role in NPR's early years was so vital that she came to be known as one of the network's founding mothers, alongside Cokie Roberts, Nina Totenberg, and Linda Wertheimer. Together, they didn't just cover the news, they built a new standard for it. Over time, she took on new roles, as a special correspondent, interviewer, and storyteller. She covered everything from politics to culture, from the serious to the sublime. And always, her voice carried that same clarity and grace. In 2025, just months after retiring from NPR, Susan passed away peacefully, surrounded by family. Her final broadcast, aired earlier that year, was a reflection on a lifetime spent listening, a farewell filled with gratitude, tributes poured in from across the nation. NPR's current CEO called her the soul of our storytelling. A longtime colleague shared on social media, "For more than 50 years, Susan showed us that journalism could have a heart." And one listener wrote simply, "Her voice was my comfort through decades of change." Those who worked beside her remember her laughter as much as her professionalism. She had a gentle humor and an unwavering curiosity about people. An interview once, when asked what kept her motivated, she replied softly, "Every person has a story worth hearing. I never got tired of discovering them." Her approach changed how public radio sounded and how it felt. She brought intimacy to a medium that often felt distant. Through her interviews, she invited the listener to lean in, to care, to connect. She also broke barriers without ever making it about herself. In a time when women's voices were rarely heard in broadcast journalism, Susan's success opened doors for countless others. She didn't fight with anger, she led with excellence. And through that quiet leadership, she helped reshape an industry. In the years following her retirement, NPR honored her legacy with the Susan Stamberg Fellowship, supporting young female journalists in public radio. It was a fitting tribute to someone who had spent her life encouraging others to find their voice. Even outside the studio, Susan's curiosity never faded. Friends recall that she was as engaged in life off-air as she was on. She loved art, travel, and long walks filled with conversation. She had an endless fascination with how people lived and what they believed. Her interviews with cultural icons like Leonard Bernstein and Maya Angelou remain timeless examples of how conversation can become art. She asked simple, honest questions, and in return, people opened up to her in ways they rarely did elsewhere. Behind the microphone, there was no ego, only sincerity. That sincerity made her voice unforgettable. Her passing leaves a silence that feels too wide to fill. For more than 5 decades, her tone, calm, steady, compassionate, was the sound of trust. In moments of national crisis, her presence reassured. In times of joy, her laughter reminded listeners that news could also bring hope. A former NPR producer said it best. Susan taught us that journalism isn't about being the loudest voice. It's about being the clearest one. Her story is not just about one woman's success. It's about how one voice helped shape an entire medium. When NPR was still finding its identity, she gave it a soul, a sense of purpose that still guides the network today. As the radio world reflects on her passing, there's a quiet gratitude in every tribute. People remember where they were when they first heard her, or how her stories made them pause and think. She connected a nation not through breaking news, but through understanding. Her family described her final days as peaceful, filled with laughter and listening, the 2 things she loved most. She was still curious about everything, her son said. Even at the end, she wanted to know what everyone else was thinking. That curiosity, gentle, endless, and kind, defined her life. It made her more than a journalist. It made her a teacher of empathy. Today, as we remember Susan Stamberg, we remember more than her career. We remember the comfort of her voice, the depth of her compassion, and the quiet courage it took to change an industry with grace. She once said, "I've always believed that listening is the greatest act of respect." Those words now echo like a farewell, a reminder that in listening to others, we honor the best part of ourselves. In studios across the country, young, reporters still sit before microphones, inspired by her example. They speak softly, ask with care, and listen fully, carrying forward the standard she set. Susan Stamberg's voice may have fallen silent, but her influence will never fade. It lives in the tone of every story told with empathy, in the calm, confidence of every broadcast that seeks understanding over noise. And as the airwaves carry on, one can almost imagine her voice among them, steady, wise, and endlessly curious, reminding us that good journalism, like good humanity, begins with listening. It was a quiet morning in Kathmandu when the news was confirmed. Kanchha Sherpa, the last surviving member of the first expedition to reach the summit of Mount Everest, had passed away at the age of 92. For the people of Nepal and for climbers around the world, it marked the end of an era. The last living link to one of humanity's greatest triumphs was gone. Born in the small mountain village of Namche Bazar in 1933, Kanchha's childhood was shaped by the Himalayas themselves. Steep trails, cold winds, and the rhythm of a life lived close to the clouds. He grew up helping his family with yaks and farming, never imagining that one day he would be part of a story that would be told across the world. In 1953, at just 19 years old, Kanchha joined a team that would make history. The British expedition led by Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay was preparing for what many called the impossible dream, the first successful climb to the top of Mount Everest. Kanchha was hired as a porter, carrying food, tents, and supplies up the icy slopes. He had no prior mountaineering experience, only strength, humility, and faith. The journey was brutal. For more than 2 weeks, the team battled freezing winds, thin air, and exhaustion. Kanchha carried loads that weighed nearly as much as he did, climbing above 8,000 meters, into what mountaineers call the death zone. Few could survive there, but he pressed on. His quiet endurance helped make possible one of history's most celebrated moments, the day Hillary and Tenzing stood on top of the world. He was not in the summit photo, and his name rarely appeared in the headlines. But within the Sherpa community, his contribution was never forgotten. He represented the countless unsung heroes who risked their lives in the shadows so others could stand in the light. For Kanchha, the climb was not just a job. It was a spiritual journey. In interviews, he often spoke about his deep respect for the mountain, which the Sherpa people call Chomolungma, the mother goddess of the world. "We never thought of conquering her," he once said. "We only wanted to walk with her blessing." Decades later, he could still recall every detail of that expedition: the frostbitten fingers, the sound of the wind through the ice, and the tears of joy when news of the summit reached the lower camps. He would smile softly and say, "It was not just their victory. It was for all of us." After the expedition, Kanchha returned to his village and lived a simple life. He built a lodge for trekkers, raised a family, and continued to welcome visitors who came to hear his stories. To them, he was a living piece of history, humble, kind, and wise. In his later years, he became an ambassador for the Sherpa people. He spoke about their culture, their faith, and the risks they faced guiding climbers in the Himalayas. "Everest gives us pride," he said in a 2020 interview, "but it also takes many of our sons." His words carried the quiet sorrow of someone who had seen both glory and grief. When news of his passing spread, tributes poured in from across the globe. Nepal's prime minister shared, "Kanchha Sherpa was not just a climber, he was a symbol of the courage and resilience of our nation." A mountaineer from New Zealand wrote, "Without Kanchha and the Sherpa people, Everest would have remained unconquered." He carried history on his back. In his home village, prayer flags fluttered in the mountain wind as locals gathered to honor him. They lit butter lamps and chanted blessings, their voices rising softly into the thin air. Among them were young guides and porters, the new generation inspired by the stories of men like Kanchha. His family described him as a gentle man with a deep laugh and endless patience. "He never spoke proudly of his achievements," said his grandson. "He just said he was lucky to have walked with great people." Even in his final days, he remained humble, a man who had touched history but never claimed it for himself. Kanchha lived long enough to see how Everest had changed. The quiet trails of his youth had become crowded with climbers from around the world. He often expressed concern about the growing commercialization of the mountain. "The mountain is sacred," he said softly in one of his last interviews. We must not forget that. His passing, in many ways, marks the closing of a chapter that began with human courage and reverence for nature. He was the last living witness of that first climb, the last man to have carried supplies for the pioneers who reached the top of the world. Even in old age, Kanchha remained active, often walking the trails near his village, greeting travelers with a smile. To them, meeting him felt like touching history itself. He represented a time when exploration was not about fame, but about faith and endurance. For the people of Nepal, his death is more than a personal loss. It is the loss of a living bridge between past and present, between the first footsteps on Everest and the thousands who followed. In Kathmandu, a small ceremony was held in his honor. Friends, family, and fellow Sherpas gathered to say goodbye. They placed a photo of him in front of a line of prayer candles, his face serene and wise, framed by the mountains he loved. A friend who had known him for 50 years said softly, "He was part of something that made the whole world look up." And yet he always looked back, to his home, his people, his mountain. As his ashes were carried back to Namche Bazaar, the skies above the Himalayas were unusually clear. Some said it felt as if the mountain itself had opened its arms to welcome him home. For those who admired him, Kanchha's life remains a symbol of quiet heroism. He never sought recognition, yet his strength carried others to greatness. His story reminds us that history is not made by those at the top alone, but by those who lift them there. Today, as climbers from around the world continue to ascend Everest, they walk in the footsteps of Kanchha Sherpa and his generation. They climb not just for glory, but in gratitude to the men who showed the way. In the end, his greatest legacy is not the summit he helped reach, but the spirit he left behind, humble, faithful, and strong. As the mountain winds whisper through the valleys, it is said that you can still hear the echoes of that first expedition. The crunch of footsteps on ice, the crackle of radio voices, the distant cheer from base camp, and somewhere among them, the quiet strength of a young Sherpa who carried the dreams of the world on his back. Kanchha Sherpa's story will forever be part of Everest, and Everest, forever part of him. It was confirmed on a quiet Sunday morning. Struzan, the artist who gave face and feeling to generations of cinema, had passed away at the age of 78. For film lovers around the world, his death marked the end of an era, the close of a chapter when movie posters were not just marketing, but true works of art. His paintings defined what it felt like to love the movies. From Star Wars to Indiana Jones, Back to the Future to The Shawshank Redemption, Drew's brush created entire worlds before audiences ever stepped into the theater. His posters didn't just sell tickets, they built anticipation, stirred emotion, and lived forever in memory. Born in Oregon City, Oregon in 1947, Drew Struzan grew up during a time when the golden age of cinema was alive on every screen. He discovered art early, sketching the world around him with pencils he could barely afford. After studying at the Art Center College of Design in California, he began his career in the 1970s designing album covers for rock bands. But it was the movie industry that would make him immortal. His first major film work came with Star Wars in 1977. Hired to paint what became one of the most recognizable posters in film history, Struzan's art captured not just the faces of the actors, but the spirit of adventure that defined an entire generation. He later said, "My job wasn't to copy a photograph. It was to paint the emotion the movie made you feel." As Hollywood's biggest franchises grew, Drew's art followed them. His work for E.T., Blade Runner, The Goonies, Harry Potter, and Indiana Jones became visual touchstones of the modern movie era. His signature style, warm light, heroic poses, glowing faces framed in brushstrokes, made his posters instantly recognizable. During the 1980s and 1990s, every major studio wanted a Struzan poster. Directors like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Frank Darabont personally requested his work. Spielberg once said, "Drew paints dreams. He gives emotion to light and memory to color." But behind the fame, Drew remained a quiet and humble man. He worked from his home studio, often listening to classical music while painting. He preferred traditional techniques, pencil, brush, watercolor, acrylic, long after the industry had moved toward digital design. "I like the touch of paint," he once said softly. "It feels alive in a way computers never will." In his later years, as digital tools replaced hand-painted art, Drew began to withdraw from commercial work. He retired from Hollywood projects in 2008 but continued to paint privately. His retirement didn't mark the end of his influence, though. His style inspired a new generation of illustrators and designers who grew up admiring his work. When the news of his death was announced on October 13, 2025, tributes flooded social media. Filmmaker Guillermo del Toro wrote, "Drew Struzan taught us that a painting could tell a story all by itself. The movies he painted will live forever, and so will he." Actor Mark Hamill shared, "Every time I saw a new Struzan poster, I felt like I was seeing Star Wars for the first time again." Fans across the world posted images of his posters, sharing personal memories of how his art defined their childhoods. One fan wrote, "Before the movie began, the magic had already started, because Drew Struzan had shown us what it looked like." Those who knew him described Drew as soft-spoken, kind, and deeply devoted to his family. He lived a simple life in California with his wife Dylan, his lifelong partner and muse. "He never cared about fame," Dylan once said. "He just wanted to make something beautiful, something honest." Even as his eyesight began to fade, Drew continued to paint, often revisiting his earlier works. He once remarked, "Art doesn't end when the brush stops. It lives in the people who see it." That belief guided his life, that art could carry emotion long after its creator was gone. His studio was filled with hundreds of sketches, test prints, and unfinished paintings, a living museum of imagination. Among them were portraits of heroes, dreamers, and explorers. To Drew, they weren't just movie characters, they were symbols of hope, courage, and wonder. He often said that he painted not for the studios, but for the audiences. He wanted people to feel something before the film began. His work was about connection, between artist and viewer, between imagination and reality. In the decades since his first Star Wars poster, Drew's influence became woven into pop culture itself. His style inspired countless fan artists, gallery exhibits, and even official re-releases of classic films. For many, his art was the face of modern cinema. When asked how he felt about inspiring so many, Drew once smiled and said, "If my art made someone fall in love with movies, then that's more than enough." His passing leaves behind not just a body of work, but an emotional legacy, one of color, light, and storytelling. His paintings hang in museums, private collections, and bedrooms of lifelong movie fans who grew up gazing at his posters. To film historians, Drew Struzan was more than an illustrator. He was the bridge between cinema and emotion, the man who gave shape to wonder. Every brushstroke carried both precision and heart. His work reminded us that before a story is told on screen, it can already live in our imagination. As Hollywood mourns his loss, his art continues to speak. It tells us that beauty can be timeless, that the light of creativity never truly fades. His posters will forever hang as reminders of what cinema once felt like: grand, human, and full of soul. In his own words, painted once beneath a small self-portrait, Drew wrote, "I paint because I believe in joy." And that joy, that glowing sense of discovery, lives on in every moviegoer who ever paused to look at one of his posters and thought, this is what dreams look like. Drew Struzan's brush has finally rested, but his colors remain, shining from the walls of theaters, from the covers of DVDs, from the memories of those who once stood in awe beneath his art. In the soft light of cinema's past, his legacy continues to glow, a master who turned imagination into immortality. It was a somber morning in London when the world learned that Dame Jane Goodall, the beloved primatologist and lifelong advocate for animals, had passed away at the age of 91. The news spread quietly, but the emotion was deep, as if the natural world itself had fallen still to mourn one of its greatest defenders. For more than 60 years, Jane Goodall had spoken for the wild, for the forests, for the animals, and for the fragile connection between humans and nature. Her passing marked the end of an extraordinary life dedicated not just to science, but to empathy, compassion, and hope. Born in London in 1934, Jane's fascination with animals began early. As a child, she spent hours observing the creatures in her garden, dreaming of Africa and wild places she had only read about in books. She often said, "My mother never laughed at my dreams." She told me, "If you really want something, work hard for it and never give up." That encouragement became the guiding force of her life. In 1960, at just 26 years old, Jane traveled to what is now Tanzania. There, in the dense forests of Gombe Stream National Park, she began her groundbreaking study of wild chimpanzees, a study that would change everything science believed about them. Without formal training, she approached the animals not as subjects, but as individuals. She watched patiently, taking notes from afar, until one day she witnessed something that would redefine our understanding of the animal world. A chimp named David Greybeard used a twig to fish termites from a mound. It was the first recorded instance of a non-human species creating and using tools. Jane's discovery shattered the long-held belief that tool-making was exclusive to humans. "We must now redefine man," one scientist famously said, "or accept chimpanzees as human." From that moment, Jane Goodall's name became synonymous with curiosity and courage. Her work showed the world that animals had personalities, emotions, and family bonds much like our own. Through her observations, she gave them names instead of numbers, a radical act at the time. She saw their tenderness, their conflicts, and their care for one another. Her discoveries reached far beyond academic circles. They touched the hearts of millions. Through books, documentaries, and lectures, Jane transformed how people saw not only chimpanzees, but life itself. She reminded the world that humans were not separate from nature. We were part of it. Her soft voice, calm and deliberate, became her signature. In speeches across continents, she spoke about kindness, conservation, and the responsibility of humanity to protect the earth. "What you do makes a difference," she often told young audiences, "and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make." Jane's work evolved from science to global activism. In 1977, she founded the Jane Goodall Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to wildlife research, habitat preservation, and community-led conservation efforts. Later, she created Roots and Shoots, a program that empowered young people around the world to take action for the environment. Today, it operates in more than 60 countries, inspiring millions of students to follow her path of empathy and action. Even in her 80s, Jane never stopped traveling. She visited over 300 cities a year, speaking with leaders, scientists, and children alike. She carried with her a small stuffed monkey named Mr. H, a gift from a friend, which she would hold during talks as a symbol of joy and hope. "He reminds me that laughter and love are part of our survival," she said with her gentle smile. Tributes began to pour in as news of her death spread. Sir David Attenborough called her a light for all living things, while the World Wildlife Fund shared, "Jane taught us that every creature has a voice, and she used hers to make the world listen. On social media, one young conservationist wrote, "I became a biologist because of her. She made me believe that caring can be powerful." In her later years, Jane often spoke about her faith in the next generation. She believed deeply that young people would continue the fight she started. "There is still so much beauty left in the world," she said during her final public lecture. "If we lose hope, we lose everything." Despite decades of travel and tireless advocacy, Jane always considered Gombe her true home. It was there, in that forest by Lake Tanganyika, where she first looked into the eyes of a chimpanzee and realized something profound, that there was no sharp line dividing humans from the rest of creation. That understanding guided her life's mission. Those who worked alongside her remember her warmth and humility. A former student once said, "She never made you feel small. She made you feel responsible." To Jane, every person, no matter their background, had the power to make change. Her life was not without sacrifice. Years spent in remote jungles, constant travel, and the challenges of leading global campaigns took their toll. Yet she never complained. When asked once how she found the strength to keep going, she replied simply, "Because I love this planet, and love gives you strength." At the time of her passing, Jane was surrounded by family, close colleagues, and lifelong friends. They described her final days as peaceful, spent listening to the sounds of nature outside her window. One colleague said softly, "She left the world the way she lived in it, quietly, with grace, and with purpose." Across Africa, communities held vigils in her memory. In Gombe, local villagers gathered by the forest edge, lighting candles and offering prayers. In schools across the world, children planted trees in her honor, a living tribute to the woman who dedicated her life to protecting the earth. Her loss leaves a silence, but also a challenge to continue her work, to live gently, and to protect the beauty she spent her life defending. For those who admired her, her message still echoes clearly, that compassion is the most powerful force we possess. Jane Goodall once said, "Only when our clever brain and our human heart work together can we truly call ourselves intelligent." Those words now serve as her lasting message, a reminder that science and love are not opposites, but partners in healing the world. In her legacy lives the voice of every young person planting a tree, every researcher studying wildlife, every person choosing kindness over indifference. Her spirit remains in the forests of Gombe, in the laughter of chimpanzees, and in the hearts of millions she inspired. As the sun sets over the Tanzanian hills, the sound of the forest carries on, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a chimp, the whisper of wind through ancient trees. It is a world she loved and protected with all her heart. Dame Jane Goodall may have left this world, but her voice, calm, wise, and filled with hope, continues to remind us to care, to protect, and to never stop believing in the harmony of life. In every forest that still stands, and in every act of kindness toward the living earth, her spirit endures the eternal voice of the wild,